Welcome to AINdebrief, where we take a look back at the most important aviation stories of the past week by the AIN editors who covered them. I'm AIN Alerts editor Chad Troutvetter. In this week's episode, AIN Wichita-based editor Jerry Siebenmark marks the first flight of the Cessna SkyCourier, a new high-wing turboprop twin from Textron Aviation. Senior editor Charles Alcock gives new developments on the eVTOL front, including a new aircraft from a just-announced startup called Archer, and a U.S. Senate bill that could hurt Chinese companies such as eVTOL manufacturer EHang. Senior editor Curt Epstein highlights the 2019 and first quarter results from Swiss aircraft maker Pilatus, and also talks about an Embraer Legacy 600 that was confiscated in Nigeria for allegedly breaking COVID travel restrictions. Senior editor Kerry Lynch overviews issues facing the air charter industry as people look to travel again in the post-COVID era. And editor-in-chief Matt Thurber shares news about the first FAA certification for Garmin's Autoland system in the Piper M600, and how ADS-B data could be used for turbulence warnings and forecasts. So this week we had our first flight, Jerry, right? So what's going on in Cessna?
So that's right, Chad. Textron Aviation had the first flight of the Cessna 408 SkyCourier. If you recall, that's a twin turboprop utility airplane that FedEx is the launch customer for. And it took off on Sunday morning for a 2-hour and 15-minute long flight and officially kicked off that aircraft's flight test program.
And how long is the program supposed to last? What's the certification timeline?
They are not saying at this point, although the executives at the company have told me that they do expect it to be quite a bit shorter in duration than it was for the citation longitude.
Yeah, longitude was about 4 or 5 years, right?
Yes, that's correct.
And the SkyCourier has a lot of composite components, and there was a explosion at the Plant 3 where they did do composites. So how does that affect the aircraft, and how much composite is the aircraft?
Plant 3 is their composite fabrication building, and it's also their experimental building, and it happened to be where they were assembling the SkyCourier, which they said was undamaged in this explosion, which happened just before the start of this year. But as you recall, that explosion sent, I believe it was 11 people to the hospital, all of whom I understand are fine now. But it left quite a bit of damage to the building. And right now, looks like they're sort of in the midst of finally making repairs to that building.
And that's where they built the SkyCourier too, right?
That's correct.
And do they have more prototypes coming, or is this primarily the only one they're going to be using for flight testing?
Yes, there will be 5 additional flight and ground test articles in this flight validation program, which obviously will expand on testing flight controls and aerodynamics.
Anything else you want to add, Jerry?
Just that I think this is a pretty significant plane for the company. FedEx has an initial order for 50 copies of this airplane, which really can be used one of 3 ways: as a cargo airplane, which is what the FedEx order is for. It can also be used as a 19-passenger regional airplane, or it can be ordered in sort of a combination passenger cargo aircraft. And it's my understanding that it's gained quite a bit of interest in Asia as a regional airliner.
Okay, excellent. Okay, Charlie, so we had some news on the eVTOL front. A new company jumped into the fray. They're called Archer. So tell us about them.
Yeah, well, it's very good news because for as long as this COVID-19 crisis has sort of plagued us, people have been saying to me, well, I guess that's it for eVTOL. Nobody's going to invest in that stuff anymore. And what we had this morning was an announcement that a startup company in, of course, California called Archer is getting into the eVTOL fray. This is the first product launch essentially since the start of the COVID crisis. So it is very encouraging. And when you look into it, it appears that there's some substance there. It's a company founded by a couple of young tech entrepreneurs who had a recruitment platform called Vettery that they sold. But they're supported by a guy called Mark Law, who's the CEO of Walmart e-commerce. But before that, he had a couple of different digital platforms that he essentially sold to Amazon and to Walmart for millions and even a couple of $1 billion in one case. So there is some pretty serious money behind this. We don't know very much at all yet about the aircraft. They're still sort of defining it, but roughly speaking, they're saying it will carry 4 people up to about 60 miles at speeds of about 150 miles per hour. What seems to be significant is that it's going to have a fixed wing as part of the design. That increases the range for an all-electric aircraft, and this is an all-electric aircraft with batteries. So, whereas some designs that don't have fixed wings can perhaps only do 30, 40 miles, this will have quite a significant amount, bit more range. It can, get from one end of Silicon Valley to the other, roughly speaking. The other interesting thing is, I put it to them, aren't you guys a bit late to the party? We've got other people saying that they're going to have aircraft in service by 2023 or 2025. They're very patient. They're saying, look, this may take 10 or more years. We're not going to concern ourselves with people who are making bold promises about urban air mobility getting going right away. And so I do believe they're in it for the long haul. Significantly, they've managed to headhunt some well-respected engineers who've come from some of their rivals like Wisk and Joby Aviation. And at face value, it's a pretty credible new market entrant.
Yeah, I was going to say they have some pretty heavy hitters. I think they have somebody from Airbus too, right?
Yes, they have somebody who was involved in the Airbus Vahana project, a guy called Jeff Bauer. And Vahana was a technology demonstrator program that Airbus had going. They then, we're still waiting to see what Airbus will do in this sector. But the fact that a pretty much unknown startup, could attract people of that sort of credibility, I think, is of some significance.
That's pretty interesting, yeah. So, but there's some other news in the eVTOL front in the U.S. There's some legislation going through. What's going on with that?
Yes, exactly. There's always sort of a political dimension, it seems, to the eVTOL sector. And I read this morning that while I'd been sleeping, the U.S. Senate passed some legislation that, at face value, would delist and ban Chinese companies from having public listings in the United States of America. Now, at face value, you might say, well, this is just part of this wider sort of geopolitical standoff between the United States and China, and who knows, it might never happen. It would, of course, have to get through the House of Representatives and then onto President Trump's desk before it became law. But what's significant is that, the nub of the beef that the Senate has with China is that they say there's a sort of a lack of transparency when Chinese companies get public listings in the States. They're not open about their finances and so on. I suspect it's a bit more political than that. I think it's part of the sort of mistrust that there now is, unfortunately, between those two countries. But of course, EHang, the Chinese eVTOL developer, sprung to mind because just as recently as December, they got a NASDAQ listing. And off the back of that, they started doing some flight testing in North Carolina. And it seemed like the US was a pretty big part of their future. At an online conference on eVTOLs that I attended earlier this week, the guy at EHang made no mention of the United States. He only talked about progress that they're making in China and progress they hope to make in Europe. At the time, that didn't really strike me as odd, but now perhaps it seems less odd given the politics of what's going on. And I have to say, EHang are doing a lot technically that is impressive. They are making some rather, dare I say it, strange claims. They say that they've pre-sold 10,000 of their aircraft before they've even been certified. I'm not quite sure what it means to be pre-sold when, you're not selling something that's even certified to be on the commercial market. So perhaps, this is part of the mistrust and part of the perception that some Chinese companies aren't completely transparent. But I think we've got a long way to go in this story.
Yeah, I think so. They're going to be releasing quarterly results next week, right?
Yes, that's right. I'm going to be tuning into that, and who knows, maybe I'll learn a bit more about this.
Okay, great. Thanks, Charlie. So, Curt, let's talk about Pilatus. They had a decent 2019, but they're a little reserved on 2020. So, what's going on at Pilatus over there?
Well, Chad, speaking of annual reports, the Pilatus did release their annual report, and yes, it was a very good season for them last year. They reached a record in production deliveries with 83 PC-12NG turboprops, 40 PC-24 light jets, and 11 PC-21 military trainers. So for them, it was an output that has not been equaled, but the company is aware, obviously, of what's gone on since. And while they start off with a good 2020, it's been impacted like most of the manufacturers. They instituted some staffing slowdowns, but they've since rebounded. As you know, the private aircraft market right now is different than what it's been for the last decade. Normally, you've had the large aircraft, large jets in high demand, but with those and the international travel shutdowns right now, those have been slowed down, but the light jets, light turboprops, and things of that nature are still reasonably strong. So they're still in a good position as far as that goes.
Yeah, speaking of turboprops, they just started delivering their new PC-12 NGX.
Yep, they launched that last year, and they've just started delivering those. It's got an improved engine and a redesigned cabin, and those starting to flow also. And, they're in a good position. But as Chairman Oscar Schwenk said, he's like, the pandemic's pitched us, many others, into a period of severe turbulence, requiring constant fact-based adjustment of our chosen heading, to use navigation vernacular. So the company is aware of where it is, and it's been prudent in its growth and its financial situation pretty much since its existence. It's kept itself debt-free and through its investors. So it's in good standing as far as that's concerned. So it's looking prudently at the future, and it's made right decisions so far. So it's expected to pretty much come through this in decent shape.
I guess the big question mark is a supply chain, and they addressed that in the annual report too, right?
They did mention that they're experiencing continuing disruptions in its supply chain, and said that they're constantly looking at that. So that could be a hindrance to their deliveries going forward. But as far as what's under their control, they feel confident.
Okay, thanks, Curt. You had another story that you did too. A Legacy 650 by a UK operator Flarejet got confiscated in Nigeria for breaking COVID-19 quarantine. So what's the deal with that?
Actually, I believe it was a 600, but yes, it's an interesting story. And obviously, somebody picked the wrong time to try Nigeria's resolve, to paraphrase their Minister of Aviation. The aircraft apparently had applied for a humanitarian permit to operate into Nigeria, and they received it. And the flight took off from the UK. It had 6 passengers on board, and according to reports, it made one stop in Spain, where acquired another one, or a total of 7 passengers when it landed in Lagos, Nigeria, at Murtala Muhammad International Airport. And the Nigerians somehow determined that this was going to be a revenue flight. It was going to leave with 7 passengers, not necessarily the same ones. I couldn't confirm that. But they confirmed that in their minds, this was going to be a revenue flight. And they confiscated the aircraft. They arrested the crew and put them in quarantine. And right now, it's an ongoing matter between Flarejet, which is a FlexJet subsidiary, and the Nigerian Aviation Authority and the Nigerian government as to what the disposition is going to be.
Yeah, I imagine we're going to see more of this as the travel restrictions kind of lift a little bit, but still have restrictions with them and only allow certain flights.
Yeah, I listened in on a webinar, an MBA webinar a couple weeks ago, where they described security issues. And one of the things is when you're planning your missions, you have to be absolutely certain what the status is when you're going into that area. And what may have been could have changed in a matter of hours. I know in some cases, operators were given 6 hours notice ahead of a country's closing of its borders during the height of the COVID COVID-19 crisis. And with flare-ups happening around the world again, this could be an ongoing situation. So that's something that all operators should be very well concerned with and should know, based on past track record from countries, what their opening window would be for closing off their airspace.
Yeah, they need to be careful. Thanks, Curt. So actually, Kerry, let's talk about charter. You listened to a NATA webinar yesterday, and some of the presenters said that there is a race to the bottom right now. So tell us what the situation is there.
Well, Chad, the good news is charter bookings are up. People are flying, and there's a whole new level of clientele or segment of clientele coming in that had never flown before. These are people who are typically, first class, business class flyers who are calling and making inquiries. Now, some of them, once they make those inquiries, get sticker shock and they kind of sift out, but others are making bookings. So with that, there's a whole new level of education that has to go, because as first-time flyers, they don't understand the industry and how it works, but there's a whole level of demands that they're bringing and expectations. Now, on the flip side, the bad side, some of this expectations goes back to pricing. And what's going on is pricing wars in the charter sector. Now, while activity is going up, they're scraping at the bottom to get every last flight. And, I listened to an NATA webinar yesterday, as you mentioned, and one of the operators had mentioned that, there is a race to the bottom in pricing. And executive from Magellan Jets, which is a jet card company, likened it to a fire sale that's going on. And there are a couple of things that are kind of enabling this. One, you have the PPP program under the CARES Act. So charter operators are keeping their people employed and having that covered. The other thing is pricing is artificially low right now because there's a suspension in taxes with the no ticket tax or fuel sales tax from the charter end of it. So that's kind of artificially dampening prices. But this is not sustainable. One of the executives from Worldwide Jet said that they're operating barely above direct operating costs. And this can't go in for the foreseeable future. He says they go after these trips, but they don't feel good about having to fly a segment 30 to 40% less than they normally would. And with a new sector of people coming in, they're now believing that a $17,000 trip is actually $11,000. And as it goes on, that's going to become a real issue. So the message is that the charter industry has to come together to strengthen on pricing. Otherwise, it's going to destroy them once the PPP money runs out, once the taxes go up, and then they can't continue to operate at artificially low prices. And some of them aren't, because there are operators that are washing out. And that's becoming a problem because, from a broker standpoint, they're booking with an operator and then only to find out that after they paid the money, the operator is no longer there. So there's extra scrutiny going on to see how viable these operators are going. One of the executives mentioned from Magellan Jets, they've cut back their group of operators that they're using. They used to use over 100. Now they're only relying on 35 so they can have better insight to how financially stable these operators are. Now, there's another part of that coin, and that's health and sanitary measures. And they also want to have insurance that these companies are following FAA and CDC and all the other protocols, because especially with the new segment of clients, they're being particularly, the level of scrutiny of how these operators are operating and handling health and sanitation and all the other protocols. There's just a new level of scrutiny on them like there's never been before. And if a client steps on a plane and they're in an FBO where people aren't social distancing and there's no hand sanitizer and there's food everywhere and there's no masks, they're turning around and they're complaining to the operators. They're complaining to the brokers, and they're not wanting to book with them again.
And so these flyers are coming because they're looking to fly more safely. And how do they expect to keep them long term? Do they have any plans for this? Do they talk about how do we keep them, especially if the prices are low now and they have to raise them later to more market conditions?
That's one of the things they stressed. As an industry, they have to work together and make sure these clients are educated so they understand that this is not going to last and that they understand the whole dynamics of how the industry operates. But the other part of the coin is to keep them, you have to show that you've got a high level of professionalism and you are following the guidelines, because the reason why they're there in the first place is because they don't want to step on an airplane or an airliner. They don't want to go through TSA, and they don't want to have to sit in a commercial airport where there are throngs of people. So if you're not practicing your protective measures, then what's the value of switching over? I mean, so they look at this as very important to be able to emerge from this pandemic with any strength at all, because you want to keep those clients, you want them to have proper expectations, but there also has to be a little bit of self-discipline on the pricing front come in as well.
Right. But they're very optimistic about this group of people, right? Because there's a lot of people who can afford to fly private but don't in the past. And, now there is a good reason for them to do so.
Yes, it is. It is a reason for optimism because you are educating a whole new group of clientele that perhaps you couldn't reach before. And if the experience is good, then they're going to want to come back. I mean, anybody who goes through an FBO and steps on a private plane has a totally different experience. And, it's really hard to go back to the airlines after that. So there is optimism, but only if it's realistic. It's a realistic approach, and that there isn't this whole feeling of bait and switch, and that they understand that what's going on is highly unusual and they do the proper education. So the big deal, though, is the charter operators have to emerge financially stable. And if they're not unstable, they're going to be more willing to cut corners, and especially on the protective measures, but also on safety. So that's why Magellan Jets and why some of the brokers are really carefully scrutinizing their operators. From Air Charter Services, the woman executive there mentioned that her firm is checking into all these operators, and they're checking what they're doing from the sanitation and the health and safety and security part, but they're also looking to see if they're asking for higher upfront payments, whether to see if they're willing to accept funds into escrow, because they want to know that these trips are financially viable right now. So there's reason for optimism, but there's a lot of pitfalls there that they have to navigate through. And one other aspect is the availability of aircraft. There was a gentleman on the webinar yesterday from Van Allen, which is an acquisition brokerage or consultancy. And he mentioned that he's getting a lot of conversations from corporate clients who had their aircraft available for charter, but no longer want to use their aircraft that way. They don't think it's worth making the benefits of charter is not worth making that aircraft available. So that may become a dynamic in the future to watch.
Interesting. This is probably a good time to point out that AIN's sister publication, Business Jet Traveler, has some information for first-time flyers or those looking to charter an airplane. And you can find that at www.bjtonline.com. So, Matt, there was some avionics news this week. The first Garmin Autoland system was certified. So just give us a little bit of information on that briefly.
That's right, Chad, and it's a remarkable accomplishment. Garmin developed its Autoland system to help passengers in a situation where a pilot is incapacitated. All they have to do is push a button and the airplane finds a near suitable airport, lands itself automatically. But the news is that the very first certification of the system happened last week, and that is in Piper's M600 SLS. Piper calls the system its Halo safety system, and it includes some other safety features like emergency descent mode and other avionics upgrades through Garmin. But the Halo safety system is now a standard feature on the M600 SLS single-engine turboprop. So that's a lot of capability in a fairly reasonably priced package.
And this is the first application for Autoland to be certified, right?
That's correct, Chad. The M600 SLS is the first to achieve certification of Autoland. The next ones coming up are going to be the TBM 940 and the Cirrus Vision Jet, but we hear there's other aircraft in the works as well.
Interesting. So there's also more news on the avionics front. The FAA this week said that they're looking to use ADS-B data to help observe and forecast turbulence.
That's right, Chad. It's an interesting idea. ADS-B systems that are now mandatory in the U.S., some other countries generate a lot of data that is automatically broadcast and can be received for free by anybody with a suitable receiver. And a project scientist at the National Center for Atmospheric Research gave an interesting presentation in January on how some of this ADS-B information might be useful for detecting turbulence. In other words, what would happen is an airplane would fly through an area of turbulence. The ADS-B information would reflect how this turbulence affected the airplane, and receivers would receive this ADS-B information, see the turbulence effects, and use that to refine turbulence forecasts, but also warn other airplanes about the turbulence before they run into it.
Yeah, current methods are not really that great, right? We're relying on pilots to report it, and there's some other methods to try to determine turbulence, but it's not that great, right?
Sure, exactly. So right now, we're relying mostly on pilot reports, and there's really not a whole lot of those generated per day. It's on the order of about 1,200 per day during normal times, not during the pandemic. And there's another method called in situ eddy dissipation rate, or in situ EDR, and it collects data from software installed on monitoring systems, which most modern aircraft have these days, like acceleration, pressure, wind, angle of attack, pitch and roll angles. And while this is excellent data, the problem is there's only about 1,400 aircraft in the U.S. equipped with this the software on the condition monitoring systems. If we could get more airplanes involved, that'd be great. But right now, ADS-B equipment is installed in almost 140,000 aircraft. Of course, they're not all flying at the same time. But if the ADS-B data proves useful, we're going to get a lot more information out of it.
Did the FAA talk about any other uses for ADS-B data like that could be used to determine other things, maybe like winds aloft?
Yeah, actually, most airline aircraft are already contributing information that helps refine atmospheric models used for forecasting. And it's actually interesting because during the pandemic, so many airplanes have been grounded that the forecasting models are suffering from lack of information. But that information is normally fairly available.
Okay, great. Thanks, Matt. Thanks for listening to AINdebrief. Another podcast episode will air next Friday. In the meantime, go to www.ainonline.com for the latest aviation news from AIN.